Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Allahumma la sahla illa ma ja'altahu sahla wa anta taj'alul hazna idha shi'ta sahla. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى آمين. قال المؤلف رحمه الله ونفعنا الله بعلومه في الدارين آمين. وأما الدليل فهو المرشد إلى المطلوب ولا فرق في ذلك بين ما يقطع به من الأحكام وبين ما لا يقطع به. So the author he mentioned, and inshallah we'll begin with where we left off last week. In this segment here, or this section, the author is going to be delving into the nature of evidence and what evidence is. And this is very important for us because in order for any ruling to be established Islamically, so for there to be a ruling or a hukum which is established on juristic principles, there has to be a good and thorough understanding of what constitutes as evidence and what doesn't constitute as evidence. And every way in which we can reconstruct and reimagine what constitutes as evidence is important for us to be able to fully realize and to fully appreciate how these rulings are established. So the author he mentions and he speaks first and foremost about what evidence is. So he gives a definition of the word ad-dalil. So this is something that many of us use in our day-to-day lives. In fact, whenever we're in a masjid or wherever we're learning or whenever we are engaging in any type of Islamic education, or when we are inquiring about an issue pertaining to fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence, one thing that many of us have already kind of become accustomed to is asking somebody for what the evidence is for their position or for their claim. So often asking somebody what is your dalil is something that I think many of us are very familiar with. But the thing which is interesting is that many of us don't actually know any deeper than that. So that's as much as we have in knowledge regarding what dalil is. All we know is that it's something that directs you to something else. And that's something that many of the early fuqaha and usuliyin, they defined it as. So their definition of al-usul, or al-dalil, is ما يلزم من العلم به العلم بشيء آخر. It's a very interesting definition. So they say evidence is something which it obligates by knowing it, by knowing this knowledge, it obligates you to know something else. So by having knowledge of this thing, it indicates and gives you a knowledge of something else. So that's what evidence is. So it opens a new level of knowledge. It uncovers something for you. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, so this is just a random example, Inna Deena Indallahi al-Islam, this has now uncovered for me the fact that there is no other religion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is acceptable in front of Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah except Islam. It's uncovered another truth or another piece of knowledge for me. So that's what evidence is supposed to do. The author, he says, فَهُوَ الْمُرْشِدُ إِلَى الْمَطْلُوبِ. He says it's a guide to what you are, the objective of your search. The subject that you are researching and that which you are focusing on, it is the guide that takes you to that place, to that destination. So فَهُوَ الْمُرْشِدُ إِلَى الْمَطْلُوبِ. So that means we already understand there's an objective that we want. We want to establish something. We want to know what the ruling of something else is. Through understanding an evidence that speaks about this subject, it gives us that knowledge of what the objective is, and it gives us exactly what we're looking for. So it guides you. The evidence is supposed to guide a scholar, somebody who's a mujtahid, somebody who's a scholar in his field. What it does is it guides him or her to the arrival point and to their objective, what it is that they're seeking, which is the establishment of the ruling and what the knowledge of the ruling is. And the author, he mentioned something very interesting, and inshallah I'm gonna pose this to you. Are there different types of rulings? For example, evidence. Can evidence, the word evidence, dalil, in itself, can that be used for any type of establishment of knowledge? So, for example, does that include knowledge which is speculative? So, meaning, okay, so we establish that this is the ruling of whatever subject that we're speaking about, but there's a difference of opinion in this regard. The fact that there's a difference of opinion, what does that tell us? That not every single person has understood this evidence in the exact same way. So because not every single scholar of this field understood this piece of evidence in the exact same way, that thing which is giving us this knowledge, can we say that, can we use the term dalil? According to some of the ulama in the past, they would differentiate and make a distinction and say, actually, if it doesn't give you definitive knowledge that everybody kind of agrees on, then we don't call that evidence, we just call it an indicator. So that's what both he mentions here. But he's of the opinion that that's not the case. He says, وَلَا فَرْقَ فِي ذَلِكَ مَا بَيْنَ وَبَيْنَ مَا يُقْطَعُ بِهِ مِنَ الْأَحْكَامِ وَبَيْنَ مَا لَا يُقْطَعُ بِهِ. So he says there's no difference whatsoever whether the knowledge which is being established or the ruling that's being established is by means of definitive understanding or speculative. We don't go into that. All of it is called dalil. So long as it gives us an understanding, whether that understanding is absolute and everybody agrees on, or whether it's something that gives credence to a difference of opinion later on, it doesn't make any difference. The word that we used, or that which we used in order to establish this ruling, is always going to be called dalil. The author then he says, وَقَالَ أَكْثَرُ الْمُتَكَلِّمِينَ. Some of the many of the earlier theologians. A theologian is somebody who's an expert in dialectic theology. So he's somebody who understands and somebody who's an expert, especially in the knowledge of being able to establish credible proof of the existence of God, credible proof of the nature of God and what Allah and prophethood, and anything dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As far as they were concerned, they said, لا يستعمل لفظ الدليل إلا فيما يؤدي إلى العلم. According to them, they said, we cannot use the word dalil, that specific word, dalil, many of us use all the time. Says you can't use that word, or that word cannot be used except for that which gives us definitive, absolute knowledge. فَأَمَّا فِيمَا يُؤَدِّي إِلَى الظَّنِّ. As for anything that gives us an indication, or anything that leads to a type of knowledge which is speculative in nature, i.e. there can be a difference of opinion and not everybody agrees. In those circumstances, the author he says, according to the mutakallimin, فَلَا يُقَالُ لَهُ دَلِيلٌ. The word dalil cannot be used in those circumstances. وَإِنَّمَا يُقَالُ لَهُ أَمَارَةٌ. But what the word that's more applicable is an indicator of something. So instead of using the word dalil, they use the word amara. This is an amara. It indicates to us that this may be the ruling, but because we're not certain, we can only use amara. We cannot say that this is dalil. Dalil can only be used for something which establishes absolute knowledge, and it has to establish absolute knowledge. But the author of the book, he goes against this view. So he gave two opinions there. There's no difference. You can use dalil for it or whatever, whether that the knowledge is definitive or speculative, it doesn't matter. And another opinion he gave, which he attributed to many of the theologians, he said there's a difference. There's two different words, two different terms that are used. If it is something that establishes definitive knowledge, use the word dalil. If it doesn't establish definitive knowledge, use the word amara. Okay? But he disagrees, the author alayhi rahmatullah, and he says, وَهَذَا خَطَأ. He says that's incorrect. To make that differentiation is incorrect. If he makes that claim, the author, Shaykh Abu Ishaq alayhi rahmatullah, he has to give a reason as to why he took that position and why he said it's wrong and it's incorrect. So he mentions, and sometimes it goes to show you that it's very important to, whenever you are trying to define words or whenever you are trying to have a good understanding of terminology, it's important for you to give a great amount of consideration to the original language of the Quran, the Arabic language. So he mentions and he says, لأن العرب لا تفرق في التسمية بين ما يؤدي إلى العلم أو الظن. He says, because the Arabs, or the people who were the experts in the Arabic language, they never in the past ever made a distinction between something which establishes definitive knowledge and something which establishes speculative knowledge. They never mentioned any kind of difference whatsoever. They used to use the word dalil for everything. So long as it establishes something, then the word dalil was used and utilized. So he says, فَلَمْ يَكُنْ لِهَذَا الْفَرْقِ وَجْهٍ, because that means that he says this distinction cannot be given any credibility. So because that's the case, and that's something which we know through research and understanding how the people who were the experts in the Arabic language, how they understood these different terms. Having looked at that, then there's no case ever in which this kind of distinction was made. Because this distinction wasn't made, therefore, it cannot be a correct opinion. Therefore, the word ad-dalil could be used to establish that which is definitive and that which is speculative. And why do you think that's even important? Why are we even having this discussion in the first place? Who cares whether it establishes definitive knowledge or speculative knowledge? Does it matter? So that's I'm throwing that out to you. Do you think that it matters? If it does, tell me why, and if it doesn't, tell me why. Why does it matter? Why doesn't it matter? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay, very good point. I mean, you should be able to define, when you use the word dalil, you should be able to define, why you're using that. Okay. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So he's saying, in the past we have nobody, like the linguists, and the grammarians, the linguists especially, more so than anybody else. They used to use the word dalil used to encompass every type of knowledge, and they didn't make any distinction between, okay, this knowledge was established via a means of using definitive evidences, and this speculative. They never made that distinction. Therefore, you can use the dalil in any way. I'll tell you why this discussion is very important. Because 90% of the Sharia, 90% or more, is based on speculative knowledge. What does that mean? For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, فَغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ, wash your faces when you're doing wudu. وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ, and I gave you this example before. So in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that you have to wipe your head. Okay? It's a very clear verse in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it, very clear. I don't think that nobody can say it doesn't mean what it says it means. It means what it says. Okay? Now, how many different opinions have been born out of that one verse in Quran? And plus, we're talking about something huge. We're talking about something to do with purification. Purification is something that validates your prayer. It's either your prayer becomes valid or becomes invalid. So it's a very serious discussion. It's a very serious discussion. The fact that there was a difference of opinion in something so delicate as the wudu shows you that everything else can only give birth to something which will cause more differences. That's just one example. 90% of the Sharia, that's what it is. Is it wiping the entire head or is it some of the head? When you're making wudu, when you're washing your elbow, do you include the elbow? Do you have to include the elbow or you don't have to include the elbow? Well, it all depends on what ila al-marafiq means. Do you have to wipe the entire head or some of the head? Well, it all depends on what the harf ba means in this verse in the Quran. All of those differences are based on some of the most subtle issues that are related to language that in many instances and examples can have a broad range of meaning. Therefore, then, the entire Sharia, 90% plus, is established by means of speculative evidence. It can only give you a speculative, meaning that there's always a margin of error. And there's always the possibility that that opinion might not necessarily be the correct opinion. That's what it means. Unless you consider the qat'iyat, which are very small in number. Alcohol is haram. There's no difference of opinion in that regard. 5 daily prayers are wajib. There's no difference of opinion in that regard. Zina is haram. There's no difference of opinion in that regard. Those which are what we call ma'lumun min ad-dini bil-darura, that which you know by necessity, those are such a small category or such a small number of issues or cases that you can just put that to the side because everybody knows that already, and there's a handful of them. Whereas the entire body, thousands and thousands and thousands of masail, books that cover 30 volumes in writing, many of them are dealing predominantly in issues related to what we call masail al-khilafiyah, issues related to differences, okay, in which there is not 100% agreement. So that's something which is very important to always bear in mind. The author then he tells us and he speaks to us about some of the reconstructed words, okay, that give a new meaning that's related to the word dalil. So he mentioned and he says, so we know what dalil is. He's given us already a definition of the word dalil. He says, amma dalu, as for ad-dal. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, ad-dalu ala al-khayri kafa'ilihi, isn't it? The hadith, alayhi salatu wasalam. The person who guides somebody, okay, the one who guides somebody to do a good deed, he gets the reward of doing the good deed as well, because he guided this person to do something which is good. Therefore, he gets the reward. So, ad-dal is somebody who guides you to something. So, who's the one who's doing the guidance? The author says, وَأَمَّا الدَّالُ فَهُوَ النَّاصِبُ لِلدَّلِيلِ وَهُوَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. He says, as for the one who's doing the guiding, the act of guiding, that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The piece of the information could be called a dalil, but the one who's doing the guiding is who? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The author then he says, waqila, whenever you read any book in Islamic usul, or in language, or in fiqh, or in Islamic theology, whenever you see the author use the word waqila and it said, always know that that's referring to a weak opinion. Whenever you see any scholar use that word, whenever they say waqila and it is also said, automatically know that that's not the author's opinion, number one, and number two, it's a weak opinion according to his opinion. According to his view, it's a weak opinion. That's the word that they use to let the reader know that this is another opinion, but I consider it to be a weak opinion. The author says, waqila, it's also said, meaning it's another opinion, but a weaker opinion. Huwa wad-dalilu wahidun. The word ad-dal and ad-dalil mean the exact same thing. Okay? What? Ad-dalil guides you to something, ad-dal guides you to something. So it could be used for the same. Just like, and he gives an example. Kal-alimi wal-alim. Al-alim wal-alim in the Arabic language, it means the same thing. When you say the word alim and someone who's alim, it really means the same thing. However, one of these words, al-alim, is number one, is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it gives you an indication and an understanding that there is a much more intense, okay, meaning to the word. Okay? So it gives you a much more intense meaning and understanding. So the word al-alim is more pronounced than al-alim. Similarly, the word ad-dalil is more pronounced than the word ad-dal. Okay? So it's like al-alimu wal-alim. So the author says, وَإِنْ كَانَ أَحَدُهُمَا أَبْلَغُ مِنَ الْآخَرِ. Because it's the same like al-alim and alim, except al-alim, one of them, he says, has a much more pronounced and intense meaning than the other. So al-alim is much more stronger than the word al-alim. Al-alim is somebody who knows something, but al-alim, it's much more powerful and more intense in its meaning, in the meaning that it's trying to convey to you. So it's conveying to you the same meaning. So when you say al-alim, for example, it conveys a stronger meaning. And in this weak opinion, ad-dalil is stronger than ad-dal because it gives you a much more intense, it's conveying to you in a more intense meaning. However, that's a weak opinion, the author says. The author, he says, وَالْمُسْتَدِلُّ وَالْمُسْتَدِلُّ. Who is the mustadil? Al-mustadil is somebody who is seeking dalil. These are all reconstructed words from the root word of dalil. And it's important to understand because it tells you that it gives you an understanding of who is searching for knowledge, who is the one who's being sought, and what are the sources that they use in order to gain their knowledge. Al-mustadil is somebody who are talibu lid-dalil. He's the person who's seeking the evidence. Who's the person seeking the evidence? The author says, وَيَقَعُ ذَلِكَ عَلَى السَّائِلِ. It could be referring to the one who's asking a question. You could be going to somebody who's more knowledgeable than you and asking him or her a question. You could be asking them a question. So that means if you are asking the question, you are somebody who is mustadil. You are asking to be guided to a matter that's important. So then he says, why can this be used for somebody who's asking a question? لأنه يطلب الدليل من المسؤول. Because this person is seeking evidence from the one whom they are asking. So for example, you are asking a mufti, or you're asking an imam, or you're asking an alim, or you're asking somebody for something, okay, for a piece of knowledge, okay? By the mere fact that you are asking them for the knowledge, you are requesting something from them, okay? You are seeking guidance in this issue. So then he says, لأنه يطلب الدليل من المسؤول على المسؤول لأنه يطلب الدليل من الأصول. So the author says it could be referring to the one who's asking a question from the one whom is being questioned, and it can also refer to that ويقع على المسؤول. It can also refer to the one who's being questioned as well. Why? Because the one who's being questioned, let's say the imam or the mufti or the alim, they are also requesting what? Knowledge from where? Its correct sources. Like the Quran, like the Sunnah, for example, not their knowledge of there being any khilaf, their knowledge pertaining, for example, to whether or not an ijma' has been established in this issue. So they themselves are seeking. So the one who's asking the imam or the mufti, he or she is seeking. And the one who's being asked, they're also seeking. Everybody is seeking. The only one who's not seeking is Allah. But everybody in this world is seeking. So that's something which is interesting. So even the mufti, who you assume to be all knowledgeable, they themselves are also seeking. The answer that they're going to be giving you has to be based on the usul, from its sources. So they're also seeking from the sources in order to be able to give you the correct answer. These are just to play with the words. The author says, وَالْمُسْتَدَلُّ عَلَيْهِ. As for the word مُسْتَدَلُّ عَلَيْهِ, that which evidence is being sought for or sought in relation to, the author says, هُوَ الْحُكْمُ الَّذِي هُوَ التَّحْرِيمُ وَالتَّحْلِيلُ. The author says, as for the issue or the subject in which the evidence is used for, it is the ruling itself, the author says, that which is الَّذِي هُوَ التَّحْرِيمُ وَالتَّحْلِيلُ. So it's the ruling that we say, okay, this ruling is impermissible, this ruling is permissible, this ruling is disliked, This ruling is this and this ruling is that. So the actual nature of the ruling itself, that's what is referred to al-mustadallu alayh. Why? لأن الدليل, because the evidence is sought in order to establish what? Why is evidence sought? In order to establish something is halal, something is haram. That's the vast majority of people today. The vast majority of people today, that's the reason why they ask many questions. That's the reason why they want to know. You know, unfortunately, the vast majority of us, you know, all we really care about is that we're, you already have your mindset on something, and it's already there, and it's something that you want to do. You've already kind of made up your mind. I'm not saying this is everybody though, just to let you, I'm not accusing anybody. But what I'm saying is a lot of us, this is what we do. We already have something already that's in our mind. We already have something that we've already decided on. We already have something that we set our minds to. And later on, we're just kind of looking for the justification. You know, is it halal? Is it haram? Just to kind of allow you to be able to live with yourself and not allow the guilt to eat you up. You just want to hear that it's not impermissible. So that's what the dalil is used for. لأنه, the author is لأن الدليل يطلب له. Evidence is sought in order to enable me and you to know, is this permissible or is this not permissible? So that's what's referred to al-mustadallu alayh. Al-mustadallu alayh is that which the evidence is being sought in order to establish. Or then he says, wal-mustadallu lahu, which is very similar in actual fact. Hardly any difference between what we mentioned just now and the next one, which is mustadallu lahu. It means really the same thing. The word he says, yaqa'u ala al-hukmi, it also refers to the ruling. So mustadallu lahu is that which the evidence is being sought for. So in order to establish alayhi, so in order for lahu. So in the Arabic, the variation is different, but it really goes back to the same meaning. So yaqa'u ala al-hukmi, it refers to the ruling. Why? We mentioned it before. لأن الدليل يطلب له. Because the dalil or evidence is for what reason? We seek evidence every day. We always say to each other, what's the dalil? What's the dalil? No way. Is that what's the dalil that's okay? Because it's sought for what reason? To establish and give you the understanding of the ruling. Okay? And in another manuscript of the same book, وَيَقَعُ عَلَى السَّائِلِ, it can also, al-mustadall lahu, who is the evidence being sought for? It could also refer to ala sa'il, the one who's asking the question. Because they want to know something, and the mufti tells you the answer to something, so therefore the evidence was researched for you, the one who's asking. وَيَقَعُ عَلَى السَّائِلِ لِأَنَّ الدَّلِيلَ يَطْلُبُ لَهُ. It also refers to, and this is another manuscript of the book, لِأَنَّ الدَّلِيلَ يَطْلُبُ لَهُ. The evidence is sought for who? The one who's asking the question. The author then he says, وَالْإِسْتِدْلَالِ. What does the word istidlal mean? This is all play with the words. We're reconstructing everything from the root word of dalil. Okay? Which is constructed out of two root base form, which is dal and lam. Okay? And some of the linguists, they mention and they say that actually it's originally a 3-word construct. Da, la, but because of the way in which the word is formed and because of the way in which it's constructed in normal Arabic language, in the normal conversational Arabic, one of the lams was taken away. So it's mahdoof. So these are 2 different opinions. However, al-istidlal, what does that mean? The act of searching for evidence. هو طلب الدليل, the author he says, it's searching for the evidence. وقد يكون ذلك من السائل المسؤول. That could be when somebody who's asking a question is asking it from somebody who's being asked. وقد يكون من المسؤول في الأصول. And it could also mean the one who's being asked is searching the evidence from its original sources. It could refer to both. So we finished with this section, inshallah, on the nature of evidence. Are there any questions about what we just went over, inshallah, before we move on? Yes. Very good. That's a good question. What do you do when there's a difference of opinion? We're going to come to it, inshallah. So that's going to come, inshallah, very soon. But just to kind of give you a brief rundown, inshallah, when there's a difference of opinion, there are many different tools that are used by the usuliyin in order to be able to determine how you can establish the correct ruling. So there's an entire method, inshallah, that is followed in order to be able to establish which one is correct. Number one, is one of them weak and one of them strong? Okay, let's say they're both strong. Okay, they're both authentic. Okay, they're both authentic. Are they talking about the exact same thing or not? Can we establish a chronological timeline to establish if one came before the other? If so, then that means it's an issue related to abrogation. The one that came later surpasses that which came in the past. So the one that came in the past is removed. Or is there any type of universality in one and particularity in one? So you take the particular over the universal. That's something we're going to go over properly, inshallah, in the future, inshallah. So after a few chapters, inshallah, we're going to go more into what happens when there's a seeming conflict or seeming contradiction. Are there any other questions? Yes. 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 Why did we, sorry? Why can't there be many correct opinions, you mean? Well, there could be. There could be. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. The Prophet ﷺ, everybody knows this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, he said to the companions one day, لا يصلين أحدكم العصر إلا في بني قريظة. You know that hadith very well. So after the battle of Khandaq, Prophet ﷺ, he said to the companions, because at that time Jibreel said to the Prophet ﷺ, go to the quarters of Banu Qurayza, because they broke their treaty. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, none of you pray Salatul Asr until you reach the quarters of Banu Qurayza. So everybody went on their way, and the Asr prayer came in. They were to go, they wouldn't be able to reach Banu Qurayza. If they do, by the time they go, Maghrib would have already arrived, and Asr would have gone. So there was a dispute between the companions. Some of them, they said the Prophet ﷺ, he wasn't, he didn't mean that literally. He was just trying to say, be hasten and be quick, and don't take your time, But he didn't literally mean don't pray. It's okay, we can pray. While the others, they took it completely literally. They said, no, the Prophet ﷺ said, don't pray Asr until we reach there. We're not going to pray Asr. Even if we miss Asr, we're not going to pray Asr until we reach there. So this is a difference of opinion that happened between the companions. When the Prophet ﷺ, he went, and when the Prophet ﷺ arrived, and both groups of companions came to the Prophet ﷺ, they told him what happened. And the hadith mentions sawwabahuma. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, both of you are correct. So the Prophet ﷺ said, you're both right. So does that indicate that there's more than one truth, and that to Allah both are acceptable? Or is there one truth, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so long as you attempt to make the correct understanding of something, then it's okay. It doesn't matter whether you got it wrong or not. So this has been a discussion between the usuliyin for centuries, not even decades or something like that. Hundreds of years, this has been a discussion that they've been having. So there's even a difference of opinion on that issue alone. But it's safe to assume that with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's always something which Allah prefers, but how it manifests on earth, it could be, for example, someone who's a Shafi'i believes that wiping some of the head is that's the only obligation, and someone who's a Maliki believes that you can wipe the entire head. Who's right and who's wrong? Everybody has their evidences. You see where I'm coming from? So it's with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the ultimate knowledge. However, on earth when we're living, there can be more than one truth in that regard. Except in the akhirah, that's different. Yes. Then ultimately that would mean, if that's not the case, if we say that that's open, that would mean then there's no truth then. Where do you limit, for example, the whole scope of an acceptable difference? Does that make sense? So, for example, like how far do you wish to go? Because could we say then, how long until that reaches to a point where everything is there? There is a, it's a funny story. Somebody memorized. Somebody was studying in the early stages of their studies. So one thing that they constantly heard from the sheikhs is فيه قولان. فيه قولان means there's more than one opinion. فيه قولان. So every time he heard this, he would say to everybody, somebody would ask him, فيه قولان. فيه قولان. And then he would go, somebody else, something, فيه قولان. Somebody understood what game he was playing. So somebody said to him, أفي الله شك. He said, فيه قولان. أفي الله شك means, there's a verse in the Quran, it means, is there doubt about Allah himself? And he said, there's two opinions to that. The point I'm making is, when it comes to, there's a methodology. When there are things in our religion that there's no difference of opinion in. La ilaha illallah, there's no difference of opinion in that. Most of the issues pertaining to Islamic theology, there's no real difference of opinion. In issues relating to fiqh, however, there's so many differences of opinion simply because we're trying to infer a meaning from revelation. Prophet ﷺ, he's not with us today in order to tell us that's exactly what it means. And we don't have enough to be able to make an absolute, because what do you do in a situation where you have more than one hadith that speak about the same thing, but there's a seeming contradiction or a seeming conflict? There has to be a type of resolution. Not every scholar will find a resolution that's the same. And because they won't find the same resolution, that will lead to a difference of opinion. I'll give you an example, inshallah. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, I don't know if I gave you this example before, but I'll give it to you now, inshallah. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, and he's speaking about the person who's a muhrim. So a person who's a muhrim is the person who made an intention to go to the Hajj or Umrah. So they're in a state of ihram. So the Prophet ﷺ said, and there was somebody who was a muhrim, he was somebody who made his ihram. He joined the Prophet ﷺ and the companions through the pilgrimage, and he passed away. He fell off his riding animal and he passed away. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, do not perfume him and do not cover his head. وَلَا تُغَطِّ رَأْسَهُ, and bury him. فَإِنَّهُ يُبْعَثُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ مُلَبِّيًا. The Prophet said about this person, do not perfume him. لا يمسه طيبا ولا تغطي رأسه. Don't cover his head, don't perfume him, and bury him, because on the day of judgment he's going to be resurrected making talbiyah. Talbiyah is when you say labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika lak labbaik. That's what talbiyah is. So according to the Shafi'i legal tradition and according to the Hanbali legal tradition, they said this is an evidence to show that when somebody passes away in a state of ihram, you don't perfume them, you don't cover their head, and you bury them like that. And some from people from the Maliki tradition and the Hanafi tradition, they said, this hadith, same hadith, the exact same one, this is an evidence to show that every person who dies in a state of ihram should be buried in the normal way that you bury any Muslim. So you cover their head and you perfume them as well. What do you think? Does that sound confusing or what? Are they on two completely different sides? And they're using the same evidence. They're using the same evidence. We're not talking about two different evidences that are establishing two different rulings. We're talking about one evidence. That's the good question. How do they come to that conclusion? Well, according to the Shafi'i and the Hanbali understanding, it's very clear, isn't it? Prophet ﷺ, this person died in ihram, and the Prophet ﷺ said, do not bury him, do not perfume him, do not cover his head and bury him, because on the day of judgment he will be resurrected as doing talbiyah. Now, in order for you to be able to appreciate the other side, many of us who haven't studied usul, many of us who haven't studied usul properly, and maybe properly, automatically we're going to be adamant and say, okay, it's clear that that's the correct opinion. Anything else is just nonsense. And the people who say that you don't, that's just nonsense, isn't it? Most people would incline to having that opinion. But that kind of goes to show you how shallow we've become in our understanding. How can I justify? Now you have to have a mind of a faqih and usuli. How can I justify burying this person and perfuming him? And I'm going to say, I will perfume him and I will make sure that his head is covered and I'm going to bury him like that and I know he died in a state of ihram. How can you justify that? And they say, this is what the hadith says. Complete opposite. Because they're saying, the hadith also says, maybe we missed something in the hadith. Prophet said, فَإِنَّهُ يُبْعَثُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ مُلَبِّيًا. He will be resurrected on the day of judgment doing talbiyah. They say, this is a matter pertaining to revelation and akhirah. We cannot make the exact same claim for every single Muslim who passes away. And because the two are connected, burying him in that fashion, and his status in the akhirah, we don't know the status of everybody else in the akhirah, therefore the ruling doesn't apply to anybody other than this person. Do you see it? Do you understand? What do you think about the way in which that ruling has been established now? Does it make sense now? But in order to appreciate that, you would have to study usul, because you'd have to have that connection. The Prophet ﷺ, there's a correlation he mentioned in the hadith. And sometimes we miss that correlation. He said, you bury him like that because, because. There's a because there. Because so-and-so will be in the akhirah doing talbiyah. That's an issue that we can't determine for every single Muslim. Prophet ﷺ specified in a specific individual, therefore the ruling is specific. The ruling is specific. A ruling, a special case scenario, you cannot derive a general ruling from a special case scenario. Very deep understanding of fiqh and usul to come to that conclusion. But it would have went over all of our heads. All of us, it would have went over all of our heads, and it would have just made an accusation and saying, astaghfirullah, this person's against the Quran and the Sunnah. This person's against hadith. This person's, how could he not follow the hadith? That's your shallow understanding of hadith. They understood the hadith in a way that was much more deeper. So that's the point I'm making. Can you have those two different opinions? Are they both correct? They're both correct in dunya. Absolutely. Imam al-Ghazali, he said, al-ijtihadu la yanqudu al-ijtihad. It's a principle in fiqh. One ijtihad cannot counter and cannot devalue or eliminate another form of ijtihad. So all of the madhabs are accepted in our religion. All of these differences of opinion, they're all accepted. And do you think the Sahaba all had the same opinion of everything? They also had many differences when it comes to fiqh. So that's something also to wonder. Are there any other questions, inshallah? Or was that, did I answer, was there anything else? Yes. Sorry? Yes. Well, they would counter the argument that you said, that actually there is, the verse does mention wiping the entire head. It depends on how you understand the harf or the word, the letter ba. Wamsahu bi ru'usikum. What does that harf entail? What does it mean? Because if it's as Imam Shafi'i said, للتبعيض, then in those circumstances it means that you can only wipe some of the head. Because that's one of the meanings that the harf entails. Another meaning that the harf entails in this specific verse is that it could be an extra added letter for rhetorical purposes. And if it's an extra added letter for rhetorical purposes, like Imam Malik believes, then in those circumstances, it could only mean that you have to wipe the minimum is that you have to wipe the entire head. So that means both understandings are correct. Who can really be confident and say that no, one side is stronger than the other? In order to make that claim, somebody would have to reach a very high level of knowledge. I think let's do the rest of the questions at the end, inshallah. So we continue and then we'll do more, inshallah. So the author, he mentions in the next section, Babu bayan al-fiqh wa usul al-fiqh. So this section is going to be speaking about what does fiqh mean and what is usul al-fiqh. So remember, we're kind of really just delving into the introduction of the book. Still, we haven't really reached the book yet. So these are all just kind of an introductory element to the book. The author says, "Wal fiqh." As for the word al-fiqh, the author says it means معرفة الأحكام الشرعية التي طريقها الاجتهاد. Ma'rifah means to have knowledge of. Al-ahkam are rulings, fiqh rulings. So to have fiqh is to have knowledge of rulings pertaining to the Sharia that has been established by means of interpretive judgment. Okay? Ijtihad is interpretive judgment because it's the interpretation and a judgment that's made, an interpretive judgment that's made by somebody who's qualified in order to do so. The author of the book, Sheikh Abu Ishaq, he himself is opposed to the use of the word ma'rifah. And in his commentary, he mentions that. Even though he used the word ma'rifah, knowledge of rulings, he said the word ma'rifah, I don't like it. Even though he used it. And in his commentary, he mentions why. He says, قَوْلُنَا مَعْرِفَةُ الْأَحْكَامِ. He says, when we say knowledge, ma'rifah, knowledge of al-ahkam, he says, لَيْسَ بِجَيِّد. He goes, it's not a good term to use. He says, وَإِن كُنْتُ قَدْ ذَكَرْتُ ذَلِكَ فِي كُتُبِي. Because even though I mention it in my books, it's not the best term to use, he said. He goes, why? لِأَنَّا بَيَّنَّا أَنَّ الْمَعْرِفَةَ هِيَ الْعِلْمُ وَالْعِلْمُ هُوَ الْمَعْرِفَةِ. He said, why? Because I've already explained previously that the word ma'rifah is knowledge, it's ilm. And ilm is ma'rifah. So he's saying ma'rifah is ilm and ilm is ma'rifah. They mean the exact same thing. And he goes, وَلَيْسَ جَمِيعُ أَحْكَامِ الشَّرْعِ مَعْلُومَةً. He says that not every single ruling that's established in the science of fiqh, has been established using definitive evidences. It's not ma'luma. Ma'luma is something that's been established through definitive evidence. Because of that, why should I define? Remember when we did the definitions of the first lesson? For those who were with us since the beginning, we spoke a lot about the nature of defining words. The author is saying, it means this is my definition, but there's a weakness in my definition. Goes to show you how important definitions are. He's saying that I use the word ma'rifatul ahkam, knowledge of the rulings, but these rulings can't really be based on absolute knowledge. So he himself has a problem with his own definition. Ali rahmatullah. And he says, the method in which we establish these rulings is through interpretive knowledge. How do you think the madhahib all began? How do you think the madhabs even came in the first place? Yes. A madhab. Like for example, a madhab of the school, like a school of Islamic thought, like a school in Islamic jurisprudence. Madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, madhab of Imam Malik, Shafi'i, these types of ahkam. This is what we refer to as a madhab. So it's an actual school and a way of understanding Islamic jurisprudence. That's what it is. So that's what a madhab is. A madhab is the place that somebody reached in order to a final conclusion on these types of issues. That's what the actual word means. Okay? It's the place that people went to. It's a madhab. A masjid is the place that you go for where people make sujood, isn't it? A mat'am is a place where you go to eat food, like a restaurant. Okay? A musalla is a place where people go to pray salah. A madhab is a place that people went because that's the place, a madhab is the place where the final conclusion and the final point of arrival of people relating to Islamic jurisprudence and their opinions. This is where their evidence and their understanding and all of their research, that's where it led them to. So that's what's called a madhab. So then he says, والأحكام الشرعية وهي الواجب والمندوب والمباح والمحظور والمكروه والصحيح والباطل. So he says, as for the ahkam, al-ahkam is al-ahkam al-shar'iyya, it's referring to what we consider to be either wajib, obligatory, wal-mandub, recommended, wal-mubah, permissible, wal-mahdur, impermissible. So al-mahdur and haram means the same thing. Al-mandub and sunnah also mean the same thing. Wal-makruh, makruh is something that's disliked. Was-sahih, something which is sahih, valid. Wal-batil, something which is invalid. Why is that important? To know if something is valid or not valid. It's because, say for example, you pray today, but you prayed without following any of the conditions of the prayer that validates the salah. It means that your prayer is invalid. But you did pray though. But you prayed. You prayed, but your prayer wasn't valid. So that means that there's a test of validity for every action that you do. And that's going to come inshallah. So then he says, and he gives example, he says, فَالْوَاجِبُ, as for that which is wajib, so he says, مَا تَعَلَّقَ بِفِعْلِهِ الثَّوَابِ وَبِتَرْكِهِ الْعِقَابِ. What does wajib mean? It means that which it's doing, by doing it, is connected to a reward, and by abandoning it, it's connected to a punishment. كَالصَّلَوَاتِ الْخَمْسِ, like the 5 daily prayers. وَالزَّكَوَاتِ, like giving zakah. وَرَدِّ الْوَدَائِعِ, returning back entrusted items. So somebody entrusted you with an item, that's called wadi'ah. You return it back to the person who entrusted you with the items. وَرَدِّ الْمَغْصُوبِ. Remember when we spoke about, who was here last week when we spoke about the differences between stealing and usurping, and we gave different examples. So al-maghsub is somebody who usurped something and they were not hiding it. So they took it in front of you. They said, this belongs to me now. Is your phone? It's mine now. Like that. That level of just usurping somebody else's belongings. That doesn't have the same rulings as sariqah or stealing. However, that is what the author gave as an example. Meaning it has to be returned. It's obligatory for the person who usurped something to return it back to its rightful owner. وغير ذلك, these are all obligations. So al-wajib refers to all of these things because they're all by obligation. They all are connected with something that gives a reward. By doing it, you get a reward. And by abandoning it, somebody is susceptible. It's important to mention that point, is that they're susceptible to being punished. Doesn't necessarily mean that they will be punished, but susceptible to being punished. There's a possibility. So then he says, وَالْمَنْدُوبِ, and that which is recommended, مَا تَعَلَّقَ الثَّوَابِ بِفِعْلِهِ, person were to do it, they get a reward. وَلَا يَتَعَلَّقُ الْعِقَابُ بِتَرْكِهِ, but if somebody were to not do, there is no punishment at all. For example, كَصَلَوَاتِ النَّفْلِ, like the optional prayers. وَصَدَقَاتِ التَّطَوُّعِ, like for example, optional charity. وَغَيْرِ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْقُرْبِ الْمُسْتَحَبَّةِ, and other examples of anything which is doing in which somebody seeks nearness to Allah. وَالْمُبَاحِ, as for al-mubah, the author says, مَا لَا ثَوَابَ فِي فِعْلِهِ وَلَا عِقَابَ فِي تَرْكِهِ, there's no reward for doing it and there is no punishment for leaving it. كَأَكْلِ طَيِّبْ, like eating good food. وَلُبْسِ النَّاعِمِ, wearing good clothes. وَالنَّوْمِ, sleeping. وَالْمَشْيِ, walking. وَغَيْرِ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْمُبَاحَاتِ, and everything else that's considered to be just normal, permissible. However, depending on the situation and the intention of the person, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, a person can gain a reward and can also gain a punishment depending on their intention. So for example, if somebody was walking to do something which is permissible, or something which is good, then in those circumstances, walking, which is normally something permissible to do, will become an act that's rewardable. If somebody drinks a cup of water because they want to energize themselves and they want to replenish themselves in order to do ibadah or to read Quran or something, that's also an act of reward. Even though in its original ruling, it's something which is just merely permissible to do. For survival purposes though, say for example, you have a cup of water in front of you and you're dying of thirst. In those circumstances, it becomes unobligatory. It becomes obligatory, an obligation. So The mubahat changes depending on circumstances and situation. Rather than he says, وَالْمَحْظُورُ is for that which is impermissible, مَا تَعَلَّقَ الْعِقَابُ بِفِعْلِهِ, there is a punishment, okay, in relation to doing it, okay, to doing that action, وَالثَّوَابُ بِتَرْكِهِ, and a reward by abandoning it. However, this is only if the person abandons it for Allah's sake. Okay, say for example now, most of us here in this room, are we stealing right now, at this moment in time? At this moment in time, are we stealing? We're not stealing, sir. So because we're not stealing right now, are we being rewarded for not stealing? No, correct? We're not. However, if there was ever a temptation for somebody to do something which was impermissible, like stealing, for example, but then they remembered Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they said, Astaghfirullah, I'm not going to entertain that idea again, ever again, and they don't do it, then they're rewarded for that. That's something which is an important point to make. So he says, كالزنا, for example, as-zina. He gives examples of things which are impermissible. كالزنا, wal-liwat, which is sodomy. Wal-ghasb, al-ghasb is what we already spoke about, usurping somebody's money or somebody's wealth, something that belongs to somebody else. Was-sariqa, stealing. So did you notice the difference that the author made? He differentiated between what? Al-ghasb and as-sariqa. So usurping, al-ghasb is, this is yours, it's mine now. And thank you very much, it belongs to me now, and then they walk away. That's al-ghasb. As-sariqa is when you steal something, when you do it under the cover of ambiguity, quietly, and you take the item from a place in which, in normal circumstances, it's stored in a place that's suitable for that specific item. If a person breaches all of those means of guarding the item and takes it quietly, that's sariqa, that's stealing. But then he says, وَغَيْرِ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْمَعَاصِي, and many other, amongst many other things which are impermissible. The author says, وَالْمَكْرُوهِ, al-makruh, something which is disliked. The author says, مَا تَرْكُهُ أَفْضَلُ مِنْ فِعْلِهِ. Leaving it is better than doing it. Okay? كَالصَّلَاةِ بِمُدَافَعَةِ الْأَخْبَثَيْنِ. Like, for example, praying salah when you need to use the toilet. You really need to use the toilet, and you're praying salah and you're desperate to use the toilet, that's something which is disliked. Why? Because you're not going to be able to focus on your prayer. So then he says, مع الالتفات or والالتفات. Al-iltifat is referring to looking around when you're praying. So when you're praying, what do you think? Say for example, you're praying and you're looking around like that, and you're going like that, and you're kind of, your face is all over the place, and as soon as something catches your attention, you're like that. What do you think about your salah in those circumstances? Your salah is still valid because you're facing towards the qibla, your chest is facing towards the qibla. However, that salah, you don't get as much reward. So that's what was referred to as iltifat. الذي يختلسه الشيطان من صلاة العبد. Is the shaitan stealing somebody's prayer from him or her. So then he says, وَالصَّلَاةِ فِي أَعْطَانِ الْإِبِلِ. Praying in the watering places of camels. Allahu A'lam, the reason why. Some of the ulama, they mention is because when the camels are being watered, that's a time in which they become very aggressive and it can cause somebody severe harm. And some of the ulama, they mention other things as well. So then he says, وَاشْتِمَالِ الصَّمَاءِ. Ishtimal al-sama is, for example, wearing a type of clothing that doesn't give your hands any space or any room for maneuvering. If you need to do something and there's an emergency, you're completely covered up, that's makruh to do. Okay? According to what the author said. So then he says, وَغَيْرِ ذَلِكَ مِمَّا نُهِيَ عَنْهُ عَلَى وَجْهِ التَّنْزِيهِ. The author says, and that these are amongst many others which are issues that are disliked in such a way in which it's not strictly that doesn't count as a strict prohibition. As for as-sahih and al-batil, validity and invalidity, we're going to conclude with this inshallah. The author says, was-sahih, as for that which is valid, ma ta'allaqa bihi an-nufud, that which ما تعلق به النفوذ, that which gets the stamp of completion. وحصل به المقصود, and the objective was met. كالصلوات الجائزة, like prayers which have been deemed to be a salah which is jaiza is a prayer that met all of the conditions. Okay, so that means that prayer is a valid prayer. Your awra was covered. You pray towards you pray towards the qibla. You have wudu. You have no najas or impurity on you. These are all conditions, and you met all of these conditions. Your prayer is valid. Okay. وَالْبُيُوعِ الْمَاضِيَةِ, and a type of business transaction that you did, okay, that's considered to have been fulfilled in its complete sense. So, for example, say for example, somebody sells somebody alcohol according to our legal tradition. Let's say according to the Shafi'i legal tradition, somebody sells somebody alcohol. A'udhu billah. That is considered to be an invalid transaction. Why? Because alcohol isn't considered to be something which is not considered to be something that's allowed, because it's najis. And najis isn't allowed to be in the space of buying and selling, or in the entire realm of mu'amalat. So because of that, purchasing and paying money for it is impermissible. Therefore, if somebody does do that, they did buy something, but it's an invalid transaction. An invalid transaction means that it doesn't count. That item doesn't belong to you. That doesn't belong to you, and that money doesn't belong to the vendor. So the one who sold that bottle, that money does not belong to him or her, and that item is impermissible for you to utilize. That's what it means. Which goes to the next point perfectly. وَالْبَاطِلُ, that which is invalid, مَا لَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِهِ النُّفُوذ, that which doesn't get that stamp that I mentioned. Okay, it doesn't go through, it doesn't pass its point of acceptability. وَلَا يَحْصُلُ بِهِ الْمَقْصُودُ, an objective was not met. كَالصَّلَاةِ بِغَيْرِ طَهَارَةٍ, like praying without tahara. You pray without wudu. Yeah, you did pray. Technically speaking, you actually prayed because you did the takbir, you made ruku', you prayed the prayer, but you prayed it without wudu. So there were conditions that were missing. Because there were missing conditions, then it becomes invalid. وَبَيْعِ مَا لَا يَمْلِكْ, or selling, or مَا لَا يُمْلَكْ, or for example, selling something that doesn't belong to you. So imagine, for example, you take something that belongs to somebody else and you sell it to somebody. It doesn't belong to you. If you sell something that doesn't belong to you, then that's an invalid transaction. So that wealth, that money that you made as profit doesn't belong to you, and the item has to be returned to its original owner. And the author says, وَغَيْرِ ذَلِكَ مِمَّا لَا يُعْتَدُّ بِهِ مِنَ الْأُمُورِ الْفَاسِدَةِ, and anything else that also follows the exact same scenario or circumstances. Wallahu a'lam. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Are there any questions, inshallah? Yes. Yes. Very good question. Can you follow a minority opinion? Well, if for example, you have studied to a level in which you studied to a level in which you are able to determine its veracity and it's truthful to you, then in those circumstances, yes. But that comes with a lot of conditions, because you have to have been able to formulate that understanding and have been able to have learnt to a considerable level to be able to make that call. Or, for example, if a sheikh whom you trust gave you that fatwa and said, for you it's okay to do this, for you it's okay to do that, and it's a minority opinion, then it's perfectly fine. Or you follow the general set rulings of a specific madhab, and that madhab tends to hold a minority opinion or minority view in that specific issue. Then in those circumstances, then it's perfectly fine to follow a minority opinion. Wallahu a'lam. Well, it depends. I mean, if the sheikh is somebody you trust and they have a certain opinion about something, although I would always kind of really tell people to be very careful of YouTube in general, because unfortunately, YouTube is a platform that anybody can really go on YouTube and just say what they want and pretend to be what they really aren't. You have hundreds of scholars now on YouTube. They're scholars, mashallah, and they can give fatwa, but they don't even know Arabic. So you have that on YouTube today. Yeah, it's real. It's true. It's the absolute reality. So you have that on YouTube today. People who give fatwa and they give rulings and they don't even speak the language. So that's what you find on YouTube today. So I would never advise anybody to trust a platform like YouTube to gain any knowledge or to gain. I mean, if you want to listen to a good lecture for somebody who's well known, that's perfectly fine. But when it comes to issues related to fiqh, I think it's always good to ask a sheikh, someone who's known in a masjid, serves the community, somebody whose knowledge is trusted. I think that's really the best thing to do. I would avoid. I would definitely avoid something where you fall into the trap of just being entertained by something on YouTube. That's something where many people have kind of really it's a mistake that a lot of people have already made. Wallahu alam. Yes, sorry. Very good. That's a good question. What if people use difference of opinion to exploit, for example, what they prefer, and this is also another discussion. Maybe I can put this all to you. Is it a bad thing necessarily to say, okay, these are all of their opinions. This one's the one to my liking. This is the one I enjoy the most, and I like this one the best. I'm just going to follow this one. If somebody does that, for example, or for example, they look at all of the opinions and they say this one is the easiest. I'm going to follow this one. Some of the ulama, they denounced that and said that that's something which a person should never do. And I would incline to saying, depending on the situation, simply because the entire point of our deen is for it to be something which is easy for us to do. Today, unfortunately, people make a correlation between the harder it is to do, the more pious I become. When that's not necessarily the case. It's a false correlation to make. Because the Prophet ﷺ, who was the most pious, the hadith by Aisha mentioned that if the Prophet had whenever he was faced with more than one issue, he would always choose the one which is the easiest one to do. That was how the Prophet ﷺ used to be. Whatever is easier, I'm going with the easiest. That's how the Prophet ﷺ, his mindset, that's what it was. Yeah, he was the one who was the most pious. So, depends on what exploiting means. If it means that somebody wants to construct their own religion and their own madhab, and they want to kind of do something by themselves, then that's something which I would say that's not correct thing to do. However, if a person wants to follow something which is easy for them in their religion, that enables them to be able to do something, to follow their religion without having to that enables them to follow their deen without having to compromise so heavily, then in those circumstances, there's no problem with that. Depends on the situation. Allahu A'lam. Anybody else? Are there any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He lived it. Very good question. So, for example, since the Prophet ﷺ, he lived it. It was his lived reality. Alayhi salatu wasalam. The people, of course, Prophet ﷺ must have made wudu in front of people countless of times, isn't it? And all of the hadith that we have about the Prophet ﷺ in wudu, it mentions فَمَسَحَ رَأْسَهُ. All it says is he wiped his head. So say, for example, you have a situation where you know that this is a often occurring event. And the language that's used to describe the issue, or the language that's used to describe the action of the Prophet ﷺ in this issue, in one of those issues, is vague. I ate food. I wiped my head. It doesn't give me any more details than that. So because it doesn't give you any more details than that, okay, how much of the head? There's a hadith narrated by one of the companions in which the Prophet ﷺ, in Sahih Muslim actually, where the Prophet ﷺ, when he was wearing an imamah, فَمَسَحَ عَلَى نَاصِيَتِهِ وَعَلَى بَاقِ الْإِمَامَةِ. The Prophet ﷺ, he wiped over the forelock of his head, and the rest he wiped over his head cover, or his headgear. So some of the fuqaha, they said, okay, that's the smoking gun that we were looking for. You only have to wipe some of the head and that's it. And the others were like, wait, hold on a second, no, because that was an exception to the rule. It would have been very difficult to take off the headgear. So in those circumstances, that's just an exception to make it easier for somebody. Just like when you wipe over the sock. So it's much more, the whole point, the reason why I mentioned this is that it's much more, in order to kind of really understand fiqh, it means that you have to try and go all into the very nitty and the gritty details. The finer details has to be, and the finer details, we don't find it many a time in the hadith. The finer details, sometimes you don't find it in the Quran. And there's a reason why we don't find it. The reason why we don't find it is because otherwise, if we knew everything and we knew the answer to everything, there would be no value in scholarship. What would be the virtue in studying knowledge if all of the answers were already given to us? If every single thing was already established perfectly, so that I don't need to ask anybody anymore. You don't need to ask anybody anymore. You don't need to learn anything anymore. Then that means there would be no value in knowledge then. Because the lay person and everybody would be on the exact same level. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He loves knowledge. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves knowledge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept many things unknown so that it can be uncovered by people who can pursue the knowledge. That's the reason why. So the knowledge was, so that's how the reason why. Absolutely. Yeah. No, also language. Language is vague by nature. Like, for example, there's a big difference now. If I saw you doing something, and I read about you doing something, the difference is huge. I'm going to be missing so much context just by reading about you doing something rather than actually seeing you doing it. So that loss in context has to be made up for by us trying to find doing an interpretive judgment on these. Remember, we're dealing with text. You're dealing with something that's written down. You don't know the background. You don't know the when, and unless you know there's another piece of information that kind of suggests that to you. The vast majority, we don't know the exact context. We're just dealing with raw material. What do you do with raw material? You have to come to an understanding. That's the whole point of the mujtahid. And that's really what it is. You know, the Quran and the Sunnah, yes, we've got it, alhamdulillah, and it's there, but it's the raw material. What are you going to do with the raw parts? What are you going to do with it? You know, unless there's somebody who's an expert who actually can be able to guide you through the entire process, then it's very difficult. It's a lifelong journey. Wallahu alam. Oh yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And that's where the wisdom lies. Meaning that although it's something which is absolutely important, the value in trying to understand, and the journey is more important than the conclusion and the destination. That's the whole point. Are you trying to understand the truth? Are you trying to get to the point in which you reach that destination where you ultimately know exactly what Allah wants from you? So long as you are on that journey, that's all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you. That's the whole point, and that's the whole wisdom. Alhamdulillah. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if people, one thing that I've realized, a lot of people are concerned that they're doing something wrong. See, if you think that if you believe that what you're doing is correct, and you have and what you're doing has been established as an opinion which is valid by an Imam that came in the past, that's accepted, you have nothing to worry about at all. You're in safe hands, alhamdulillah. Because the people who came before us, they already sorted out all of this stuff has already been sorted out for all of us, alhamdulillah. So everybody, you're in a very safe position. So long as you're following something that's already been established, and it's held by an Imam who came in the past, one of the 4 Imams, for example, you're in a very safe position. You've got nothing to worry about, because it's something that the whole Ummah accepted. All of the Ummah has accepted it. Even the one who disagrees with that opinion, they've accepted it also, that it's a valid opinion. It's a valid opinion. Imam Shafi'i, he says, my adversary, or meaning the one who holds a different opinion to me, the scholar who holds a different opinion to me, because I believe that I'm correct and he's wrong, but I also believe the possibility that I could be incorrect and he could be correct. Because I believe I'm correct and I believe he's wrong, but I do believe also that there's a possibility that he could be correct and I could be wrong. Yeah. Yes. You came out. Yeah. Yeah. I could, of course, because that's not how fiqh is supposed to be studied. There's no such thing as fiqh sunnah. Fiqh sunnah is a concocted science. Fiqh sunnah never existed 300-400 years ago. Even I mean, Salah has always been spoken about. Any book on Salah in the past, okay, bar a very, 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 very small number, which is very insignificant in the grand scheme of things, has been written under the auspices of a madhab. So, for example, there's a book of Salah written by, for example, that's been written by Imam al-Nawawi, for example. It's not something that he just wrote from his own opinions. It's under the authority of an existing madhab. Any science that anybody in the past spoke about, and why do you think that that's important? Why do you think it's important that it was always under the authority of a madhab? So that there's no confusion and there's no contradiction. Uniformity, exactly. So that's the whole point of having of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed these madhabs to reign supreme. Because it's important for there to be uniformity also in action. But if you study just hadith and try to derive fiqh sunnah and try to derive, or fiqh salah and try to derive salah from hadith, you're going to leave that much more confused, and you would have learned nothing about fiqh. You left zero. You went there with the zero number. You would have left with minus something. That's how bad it is. When you learn any issue in fiqh, you have to learn it under the auspices and the authority of a madhab. If you don't, you would have wasted your entire time. There was one of our teachers in Medina, is Sheikh Muhammad al-Mukhtar al-Shatiti, alayhi hafidhahullah. He was somebody, subhanAllah, he mentioned the story himself, and he said he was a Maliki, or originally from Mauritania. And he mentioned when he was studying, his father was also a scholar, said to him, because at that time when he was growing up, there was a craze that existed of no madhab, we don't, what's that? We follow Quran and Sunnah and that's it. And, no madhab and all of that kind of stuff. That whole ideology of la madhabiyya existed. So his father said to him, no. He said, when you learn fiqh, you learn the Maliki madhab. That's what you're going to learn. Naturally, later on, as you evolve in your knowledge, you will begin to understand and to learn the different traditions. However, you learn a madhab. He said, all of my friends, they went on the they started learning. All of my colleagues, people who were also studying, they all went to, start learning, they start Umdatul Ahkam, and then they Bulugh al-Maram and its commentaries and all of that kind of stuff. That's what they wanted to learn, and that's what they did learn. And he said, Wallahi, after a few years, they were all, when it comes to the entire science of it, they're only coming to me to ask, because they wasted all of those years. They wasted all of those years trying to learn fiqh in a way in which you're not supposed to learn fiqh. By the way, fiqh and hadith, are they two different sciences, or are they the same thing? Or are they two different sciences? They're two different things, isn't it? So why do people conflate them then? How can you study fiqh from a book which is in hadith? Okay, it's a hadith al-ahkam, granted it is, but that's not the science of fiqh. That's not how you learn fiqh. Fiqh is learned through a matan or a text, okay, that's under the authority of a specific madhab. So for example, if I want to learn fiqh Shafi'i, I'm going to learn matan Abi Shuja'. If I want to learn fiqh of Shafi'i, I'm going to learn Minhaj al-Talibin by Imam al-Nawawi. If I want to learn the Hanbali madhab, I'm going to learn Akhsar al-Mukhtasarat. If I want to learn, if I want to learn, or I'll learn Dalil al-Talib, or for example, Zad al-Mustaqni'. If I want to learn the Hanafi madhab, there's books for the Hanafi madhab, there's books for the Maliki madhab. There are specific texts that you need to study in order for you to learn fiqh, but you have to learn it in a madhab. There's no escape. You cannot escape a madhab, whether you like it or not. And if you try to do that, your journey 10 years from today will be the same as you were. If you want to learn fiqh, learn a madhab. That's how every scholar of the past, that's how they did it. Yes, I'll come to you, inshallah. And you'll be the last one, inshallah, yes? It doesn't matter what, the names don't matter, whoever calls himself what, that I don't, but the point is, it doesn't matter who they are or what they call themselves. Anybody who bypasses a madhab and says I learn fiqh from the Quran and Sunnah, that's just completely incorrect, and it's a waste of time. And that's a promise, there is absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. You will not learn fiqh unless you study a madhab. As for learning a madhab, well, depending on what what resources and what's available, learning the madhab, for example, of the country that you are in is always preferable, because obviously we're in a country where there's a huge amount of diversity. Then, so long as you're learning a madhab, it doesn't really matter. If you're learning a madhab, so long as you're learning something, so long as it's a text according to that's known, then that's all that really matters in that regard. So that's what my advice would be. Any madhab is okay. If, for example, somebody comes from a predominantly I don't know, maybe a South Asian background or something, it's always, or for example, somebody comes from North Africa, it's more predominantly Maliki, for example. Somebody comes from Southeast Asia or maybe East Africa, it's more predominantly Shafi'i. So studying the madhab of where you come from originally, that's also an added benefit. However, in the grand scheme of things, the most important thing is just studying a madhab. The madhab of Albania is a Hanafi, is the Hanafi madhab. So if that's something that you could do, then alhamdulillah, Ustadh Ashraf, our Imam here, Imam Ashraf, our teacher, he teaches Hanafi madhab, Hanafi fiqh. So whoever has an opportunity to study fiqh, then make sure that you don't be duped and don't be tricked into studying a book of hadith. Otherwise, you'll just be wasting your time. Wallahu alam. Yes. That's a very good question, actually. Very good question. Is a madhab only for somebody who's a practicing Muslim? Somebody who's practicing? Well, yes, because if somebody is not practicing, then they're not really doing anything, are they? Usually, in order to follow a madhab, you'll have to be practicing a set of rules. So the set of rules can only be done by someone who's practicing. If somebody is not practicing, then they need to start practicing. That's the only answer to that one. And once they start practicing, inshallah, then inshallah they can join the madhab club, inshallah. Wallahu alam. Barakallahu fikum, inshallah. See you next week. Assalamu alaikum.